I was raised in, I went to school in Portland. I went to school in Vancouver when I was younger. Uh, I lived in Seattle. I spent my teenage years in Seattle. And I went into the Army when I was 17. Uh, I stayed in the Army for about 3 years, and I didn't like military life, so I got out and I worked for a few years. And then I met my wife. About the time that I met her, they reenacted the GI Bill. So since I was a veteran, I was able to take advantage of the GI Bill. So I started to college, and I graduated. I started late. Probably started. I was about 27 or so, and I was still married at the time. And then before I finished, my wife and I had separated and got a divorce. But I finished my degree, and my degree was in English with a Spanish minor. And after I graduated, I went to Europe for a while. I spent some time in Europe. And then I came back. I landed on the East Coast in New York, and I thought about going back to Europe. I was going to go to work and save up money and go back to Europe. And I had a bad experience in New York, so I moved up to Portland, Maine, and I lived in Portland, Maine for a while. And I never did get back to Europe then anyway, but I wound up in Minneapolis, where I went to the University of Minnesota, and to get a teaching certification. I had some problems in the classroom. I just didn't feel like I was suited to be a teacher. So anyway, I lived in Minneapolis for about 10 years, and I finally came back to the West Coast, and I settled in Portland lived there for 10 years, and I worked in the mental health field, and then I moved up here to Tacoma, and my stepmother she was living at that time, and she lived out here on Key Peninsula. I've been living in Tacoma ever since. I worked in the mortgage industry for a while. I drove a van, a medical van type thing. I did that for a while. So I also have a private detective, a private investigator license, but I don't do much with that yet. That's one of the things I'm kind of working toward. And so in the meantime, I do this process serving, and although I am retired, so that helps too. I get Social Security plus VA disability from the Veterans Administration, and so it all helps. But as to the story of my life, I don't know where to begin. I started out a number of years ago wanting to be a writer, a professional writer, and I, with that in mind, I've written a couple of novels. One that I published on my own, which I kind of regret. I wish I'd tried harder to get to have it published by a what they call a brick and mortar publisher. And I've also written some screenplays, and it's kind of for a lot of people, it can be a solitary occupation, a solitary endeavor, and that's kind of what it's been for me. Maybe to my detriment sometimes, but that's it is what it is. Yeah, this is the book, the novel, and it's not anything great. It's not even inspirational. It's just entertainment, basically. But I'm pretty proud of it. Yeah. Now these are some manuscripts. Yeah, this is one of my most recent. Yeah. Now this is I think that's my first novel. What do we got here? This is what is this? Oh yeah, this is one that I especially like. It's called Ancient Whisperings. Synopsis, another synopsis. Here we go. No, this is Ancient Whisperings. This is another Ancient Whisperings. Oh, that's Sparkle. That's the same one. Yeah. But then I've got one on my computer. I think I've got the hard copy. I'm not sure where. Right now, I'm trying to, eventually I want to start my own business, and I'm working as a process server. You serve legal process on people. You serve the documents telling them that they have to go to court, they have to make an appearance in court, or they have to abide by some, uh, uh, in a legal, they have to respond in some way. This is a summons, and there's probably a complaint here. There's it's a court document, and if somebody gives this to you, it means you have to show up in court at a certain time. And there's a complaint. It's usually about it. Here's a complaint for damages. I don't read through these things, so I don't know, what about the details. But there's been some kind of a complaint made. Maybe it's a car accident. It could be, any number of things. Maybe it was a dog bite or something. I don't know. But so this is most of it. Summons and complaint. Sometimes you'll get a subpoena, meaning that you have to show up there at a certain time. You have to be in court at a certain time, or they can come and arrest you. I don't very often, but once in a while I'll get a person on the phone, if I have a phone number for them, and I'll tell them, that you're subject to being arrested if you don't respond to this, which is fudging it a little bit. I mean, yeah, they can be arrested, but I never say you will be arrested. I just say it's possible that if you don't respond, you will be arrested. And that usually perks them up a little bit, so they'll say, okay, well, I'll meet you at this time. So that's the best way to do it. The other way I do it too is I always try to get a signature, and because if their signature is there, that proves beyond a doubt that they have been served. These are all my cover sheets, okay? So I have them. Now this other basket over here, these are documents that I printed off, but I wasn't able to get the person. They weren't home, or they just, maybe it was the wrong address, and nobody knows where they are. So I just keep the documents in case they come back to me and say, well, we found out where this person lives, and can you go serve him? And I've got the document. The documents that are sent to me that I have to deliver to people, I get them on the computer, and then I print them off on my printer. And in fact, I have some right here. This is what they usually look like. This kind of thing. They can look. They're not all the same. And this one is about a divorce. She's you'll see some writing on this, and this represents about 3 or 4 attempts to serve this guy. And last night, as a matter of fact, I was out there and I made an attempt to serve him, and I hadn't seen him. This is a person that evades. They deliberately avoid trying to be served. So what they'll do is oftentimes is they close all the blinds, they pull the curtains. You look at the house, you don't see any lights. You don't see a car in the driveway. The garage is closed. You'll knock on the door, you'll ring the doorbell, you go around to the back of the house, you'll knock on the sliding glass door, nobody answers. So you know that they hear you, but they just don't answer. And that's this situation. This guy didn't answer. So I've been out there about 3 times, and last night I pulled up, it was dark, I turned the corner, and his house is almost right around the corner, and I turned the corner, and I saw him walking to his car. So I immediately pulled up behind his car, and so they couldn't back out. I grabbed my documents. This isn't his, but it would be a document. I grabbed it, and I jumped out of my car and I ran up to the side of his car. He had already got into his car. He saw me. He recognized me from being out there before. He recognized my car. And see, he was probably looking out the window when I was knocking on the door and trying to figure out if anybody was there. And that's what they do, so they recognize you. Anyway, he recognized me, so he jumped in his car. I jumped out of my car. I ran up to the side of his car, but he got into his car, and he wouldn't roll down the window. And I kept saying, I won't use his real name, Mr. Smith. Are you Mr. Smith? And he kept saying, I won't tell you what he said, but just he kept saying, just move your effing car, move your effing car. And I kept saying, well, are you Mr. Smith? Are you Mr. Smith? And he finally said no. And he reached over to his glove compartment, and I figured he was going to maybe pull out a gun or something. So I went back to my car and I moved it. He backed out and he took off. Well, I thought about it since then, and I'm sure that was the man I wanted. And what I could, had I known it was that he was Mr. Smith, I could have done what they call a drop serve, and that's where he doesn't have to accept it. That's where I could just toss it at him and say, you've been served, and that would be a permissible serve. But I couldn't do that with him because I wasn't absolutely certain that he was Mr. Smith. I didn't know that at the time. I suspected as much, and his behavior told me as much, but I didn't know that, so I couldn't do that, because if I did that, and it turned out later that he was not Mr. Smith, then our client, if I reported the serve, then my boss would go to the client and say, well, your subject has been served. But then if it turned out that it was the wrong person, then the boss would hear about it, and it just doesn't look good. So I didn't take a chance. I didn't try to serve the guy. But anyway, this is the cover sheet. And I made about 4 attempts. I notified my boss. I wrote an email to him, and I told him what had happened. And he got back to me, and he said, well, the client decided they're not going to serve him anyway, so don't worry about it. So what I have to do is he will give this to the client. I will fax it to him. Not fax it. I will PDF this and scan it and PDF it in the printer, and then I will get it off to my boss, and then the boss will turn this over to the client. And this is proof that I tried to serve him. But most of the time it's a routine serve, and that means you go out to the house and you knock on the door, and if the person isn't there but somebody else lives there, and if they're above a certain age, then you can serve them, and they call that a subserve. And you could say, I subserved Mr. Smith's mother, and that's legitimate. That's a legitimate serve. The serve last night was highly unusual. Usually, I don't encounter hostility of any form. People are a little grouchy, maybe, but this is the first time now in about 9 months since I've been doing this, where where somebody is threatened to get hostile, and but it's like it's just, you have to shrug it off. I mean, I don't, I'm not any the less enthusiastic about my job. I like this job very much. It gives me a lot of freedom. I set up my own time, my own schedule. If I want to start late, I can. If I want to start early, I can. Oftentimes I find the best way to get people is to show up maybe at 5:30 or 6 in the morning and just kind of hang out and wait till they leave the house to get into the car to go to work. And then you just walk up to them and say, Mr. So-and-so, and they'll turn and you say, and once you've established their identity, you just say you've been served. And at that point, you probably want to leave pretty quickly. You know, you don't want to give them a chance to maybe lash out at you or cuss you out or anything like that. Most of them don't. I don't think that happened. That hasn't happened. Last night, as I say, was the first time. A lot of these people don't realize that if you make so many attempts and that you're never able to get the person, I think I'm not certain about this, but I think the client, meaning the lawyer, the law firm, I think they have to get permission from a judge, and they have to go to the judge and they have to show him, well, we've made all of these attempts, Your Honor, and we've been unsuccessful. So can we do the next thing, and that would be mail. Send it through the mail to this person. And then I think they also, I'm not real certain of this, but I think they also can advertise in a local newspaper. So that if they try to mail it to the person, and if they advertise in a local newspaper, that serves as a good serve. That's the same thing as if you were to go to the house and hand it to the person. They call that, they consider that a serve. In other words, you've been served if they can put it in the paper, if they mail it to you. What happens if the mail gets returned? I'm not sure how that works. But most people, even those that try to evade, they don't realize that they may get away with evading the server, the process server, which would be me, but they're going to get a letter in the mail eventually, and so they'll get the documents one way or the other. And they also don't realize that judges don't like people who try to avoid being served, you know, who deliberately try not to be served. Judges frown on that. So that could affect the outcome of the case. Say it's a lawsuit, somebody brings a lawsuit against you, and the judge has to make a decision, and he sees, well, you know, this guy has been trying to evade all the time. So the process server, while he's a low man on the totem pole, he's also a vital part of it. And so I feel pretty good about what I'm doing. A lot of people, you know, they're resentful. Well, you're just a process server. Yeah, but, you know, I'm a necessary part of it. You may not realize that, you know. So, anyway. So, I was born in Seattle, and in 1943, and which makes me 77 years old in February. My dad at the time worked. He was what you call a lineman. That's an electrical. You know, these people that do work on power lines. He left Montana when he ran away from home when he was 13. This was way back when, the early 20th century, and he was raised on a ranch. And he ran away from home when he was 13, and he took up with a medicine man who had a wagon, and the medicine man taught my dad how to tap dance. So they would get into a town, and he would lower the gate on the wagon, and my dad, and there was a colored kid, a little black kid, the two of them would get on the back of the wagon. They would tap dance, and it would draw a crowd, and then the medicine guy would sell his medicine. And so forever after that, when my dad was at a party or whatever, he'd start tap dancing, and so he was kind of a colorful character in that way. My mother was, I don't really know much about her because she died when I was 2. I do know that he was 36 and she was 21, so there was quite an age gap there. And she was German, but I don't know any more about her than that. When she died, my dad let me live with a family, a friend of his, Ted and Jerry McConaughey. And he was working in the shipyards at that time. This was during World War II. And he invented some kind of a device or gadget that made working on the ships easier. And the government paid him $25,000 for this, and then for the rest of his life, he got a royalty of $200 a month. So anyway, I went to live with these people for about 3 or 4 years until my dad remarried. During the time I was living with these people, I had a pretty good life. He had became a chef in Los Angeles. He worked for a big hotel there, restaurant, and then they moved up to Seattle and bought a house up there. So I had a pretty good life, and then my dad remarried, and I have to say that my stepmother and I never got along very well. She had a daughter, so I had a stepsister. And little story, quick story, when my dad brought me home to introduce me to her, we sat at the dinner table, and my dad said to me, he said, "This is your mother now." And I looked at her and I said, "Well, my mother's in heaven." And there was just something about that ticked her off. And I don't know if she just developed a bad attitude toward me for that reason. But anyway, we never got along, so I never warmed up to her, and I don't think she ever warmed up to me, and that's pretty much how it was with her for the rest of my life. She passed away about 10 years ago. Anyway, not to get off the track, but my dad separated from her after a couple of years. Now, they didn't divorce, but he separated, so he came up to Portland and he dropped me off at his mother's, my grandmother. And my grandmother took me to put me in a boarding school in Portland, or in Vancouver. At that time it was called Providence Academy, and it was a Catholic boarding school. And I was there for about 3 years, and I ran away a couple of times from there. And it was kind of an adventure, kind of a lark, and I wasn't really trying to get away from anything, from treatment or anything of that nature, bad treatment. But anyway, they asked my grandmother to take me out of there because they just couldn't abide that kind of thing, I guess. So they put me in a place she put me in a place, another Catholic boarding school called St. Mary's, and it was out in Beaverton, Oregon. And I was there for probably 4 years, easily 4 years, and until I graduated from grade school. And I also ran away from there several times too, but it was usually during the summertime when the weather was nice, and I and another guy would probably just run away and be gone for 2 or 3 days, and then we'd come back, and they never made much of a big deal out of it. It was kind of just like an adventure. It was kind of a Huckleberry Finn kind of adventure almost, And we'd go out in the woods and one thing or another, and build a campfire and that sort of thing. So And this was the first Catholic boarding school that I went to. And we planned it, a guy named Bobby Culbertson. And I think we couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old. And they had a bike shed in back of this. Well, actually, it was a skating area, a covered skating area in the back of the school. But inside this covered skating area, there was a bike shed. There was just like a big closet where they kept the bikes. And I was given the key to unlock it, and then I was supposed to lock it back up and take the key back to the nun. Her name was Sister Florence. Well, at the end of the day, when I was supposed to lock it back up and take the key to her, I left it open. And that night, Bobby and we slept on the 3rd floor of the building. That night, after everybody went to sleep, he and I snuck down the fire escape. And we went up and we got our bikes out of the shed, and we just went down the road. And we were gone for 4 days. And I don't remember what we ate during that time, but I do remember that it was the time of the year when the blackberries were ripe. So we ate a lot of blackberries. And I don't remember what else we ate. And but at the end of the 4 days, we were down by the river in Portland, down by the Hawthorne Bridge. I don't know if that area has probably changed a lot since then. But this was back in the 50s, and there was a car down there, and the guy had a sack of groceries in the car. So we took the milk out of the sack of groceries, and we took the bag of cookies out of the sack, and we had milk and cookies, and we both fell asleep down there. And the plan was we were going to sell the bikes in the morning and hop a train and go down to California. I don't know why we thought that, why we came up with that plan. But anyway, we fell asleep. Well, as it happened, they found, somebody discovered us there, and they turned us into police, and the police picked us up. And all of this, it had been in the newspaper that we were missing. I can't find the one with the picture, but here's the story anyway. Yeah, there's the story. Here's a picture of my grandmother and my dad. So when the police picked us up, they bought us a hamburger and everything. And I've got a picture. I meant to dig it out to show you where Bobby and I are sitting together, and there's a little story underneath, But anyway, they took us back to the school. Nobody said anything. I'm hoping I'll come across that picture, but I don't know. Oh, here it is. Yeah, here it is. Yeah, there it is. But then another time, a guy named Roxy Thompson and I ran away.
It was a beautiful summer day or something, and I don't know why we got this impulse. But anyway, he and I took off, and not on bikes. We just walked off. We walked through town. We walked across the bridge. There's a bridge in Vancouver. It used to be the main bridge across from Vancouver to Portland, from Washington to Oregon at that time. That was before they built the freeway. Anyway, we went down there and we crossed that bridge. And I'll never forget the one incident. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but we went down to the river. It was not the Columbia, not the river itself, but it was the Columbia Slough. And there was a dock, a square dock. And I was wearing a pair of boots. And Roxy, and we stood on the docks, and I don't know what got into my head, but I told Roxy, I said, Roxy, you walk across, I pointed to the roadway, and I said, you walk across the roadway to the other side, and there were some pilings across the Columbia Slough there, and they were probably like about 10 yards apart. And I was a pretty good swimmer, for a kid. I'd grown up on a lake, or I spent time on a lake when I was up at Lake Stevens when I was for a short time, for a year or so, when I was with my dad and stepmother. And so I said, Roxy, you walk across that roadway, and I said, I'm going to meet you over there, but I'm going to swim over, okay? And I don't know what possessed me to say that, but I had these boots on, and it just never occurred to me to take the boots off. So I dove into the water, and the boots just really weighted me down. And I had the hardest time coming up, and the dive had sent me like maybe 10 feet away from the raft. And so I had the hardest time coming up, and I was breathing hard, and I didn't try to swim. I tried to swim back to the dock, and I finally made it, but I was so out of breath when I got to the dock, I just laid on the dock and just panted. And Roxy was standing there, and I'll never forget the way he looked when I came up out of the water. He was just scared to death. He was just looking like that. He was just stone-faced. And when I got back to the dock, I just laid on the dock and I just panted for the longest time because I'd struggled so hard to get back to the dock. But there was another thing that I remember about that particular incident. There was a man up on the bank, and he was smoking a cigarette, and he was just standing there watching me. He didn't seem at all concerned. He just stood there smoking a cigarette, just watching the whole thing. Anyway, Roxy and I continued. I was soaking wet, but anyway, we continued on our journey, and we got into Portland. And I don't remember, I don't remember what happened. But anyway, they picked us up, and they took us back to Providence Academy. Well, that was the second time for me that I had run away from there, and this was something that nobody did, I guess. So they asked my grandmother at that time. I was living. She was in charge of me because my dad was off working, and so she asked my grandmother to take me out of there, and that's when I happened to go to St. Mary's. But that kind of, those running away things, they were, that happened to me frequently through the times that I was there. And I don't know why I ran away. I don't know if I ever ran away because I was unhappy or dissatisfied. Anyway, that was a memorable part of those, of those schooling years. Though there was more to it than that. I mean, I played, when at St. Mary's, I played football and basketball and baseball. so I was quite athletic, and the well, anyway, so. There was the one time that I ran away from St. Mary's, and I was with a fella. His name was Larry Bosworth, and he and I had run away together 2 or 3 times before, a couple of times before anyway, and it was usually during the summer months. And but this time, this particular time, I think it was in the middle of winter, and St. Mary's was the school itself, and the buildings, the gym, and some cottages where the kids lived. There was also, the school was here, the gym was back here, and in between the school and the gym there was a football field, and then there was another playing field over here, and then there were cottages. There were 2 cottages. There was Christie Cottage and Heesacker Cottage, and then there was the main building. And behind all of this was a barn and a shed with tractors and farming equipment, because off to the side, or the north of school, they had a lot of fields, and they raised their own potatoes. So every year we would go out and pick potatoes. We would all ride out on a flatbed wagon. It was pulled by a tractor, and you would go out and you would load up the tractor with potatoes, and then come back and put them down into the root cellar. It wasn't actually a root cellar, but it was a cellar-like thing. And anyway, so what I was getting at is that one winter, there was a woods. It was quite a stretch of just woods, forested area behind all the farm and the barn, and they had ducks and pigs and some cows, and behind all of these fields for these animals, you had a stretch of woods, and every year in the wintertime, there was a depression going off toward the fields. There was a depression in the ground that would fill up with water, so it was like there was a little lake out there, or a big pond. And then there was a creek running through the woods, and it would overflow. I'm not sure where we went first, but anyway, we wound up back at the woods. We were in the woods behind the school, and we had a couple of cans of beans. I don't remember where we got the beans, and it was wintertime and it was cold, so we were out in the woods, and we built a fire. Well, in order to start the fire, we had matches, but we didn't know how to start the fire with just the matches. So we snuck up to would have been in the evening, and we snuck up to the barn area, and we stole some gasoline that was used for the tractors. And we went out we went back to where we were trying to build a fire. And so we had a can, and we managed to get a little bit of a fire going. and we had a can, a tin can. We poured a little gas into it and throw it onto the fire. Whoop, and we jumped back. And each time it did that, but finally the wood, which was kind of damp, it finally caught. So we had a fire going. And I don't know whose idea it was, but we thought, well, we were going to get a duck and cook the duck, right? So we snuck back to the farm area, and we got a duck. We got a hold of a duck. And well, in order to cook the duck, you have to kill the duck. So neither one of us, we were both squeamish about killing the duck, about chopping its head off. So I tied a rope around its neck. So I was twirling the duck around like this, and the duck was going like this, and it was quack, 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 and it was threatening, but it didn't do any good. So finally, we just resigned ourselves. We were going to have to cut the duck's head off. So that's what we did. We cut the duck's head off, and we took it back to the fire where we had the fire, and we had to, of course, we had to take all the feathers off. Okay, so we took all the feathers off, but by then, and we cleaned it out, and took it down to the creek and cleaned it out. But by then we were so hungry, we cut pieces of meat off the duck and stuck it on a stick and held it over the fire for not very long. So we almost ate the duck raw. And I had managed, I was wearing a pair of jeans and I got my jeans wet. And we had an Indian blanket. It was a blanket with Indian symbols on it and American Indian symbols. And I took my jeans off and I was wrapped up in this blanket and I had my belt around it to hold up to hold the blanket in place. And I don't remember whether we slept by that fire that night or not, but I do remember that every time the fire got a little low, we'd put some more wood on it and then throw some gas on it and go foof like this. And we were lucky we didn't, burn ourselves. But I think that night we tried to sleep by the fire, and the fire died down, it got cold, and we were wet, and it was the middle of winter, and you could see the steam coming off, the fog coming off the creek and that sort of thing, so it was really unpleasant. And what we finally did is we just went back up to the school, and this was in the middle of the night. We went back up to the school, we went up to the dormitories, and we just got into bed. And the next morning, when everybody woke up, we were there, we were back, and we were kidded about having run away, but nobody said anything, the authorities, the fathers, and the nuns, nobody said anything. But so anyway, that's one of the stories, and it's one of the memorable stories. I remember me out there trying to, with the rope around the duck's neck, and I was swirling it around like this, but anyway, that was one of them. And there was another time when they had a bazaar at the year end, at the end of the school year. They had a bazaar down in the gym, and they had some booths set up, and it was just like like if you were going to a carnival and throwing darts and that kind of thing. They had that all set up, and Larry and I, we manned one of these booths, and people would come up and they'd pay to do this. So we got a roll of quarters, and we kept this roll of quarters. And the next day we took off. He and I ran off. We had this roll of quarters, and we went out into the country, and we holed up in a barn out there, and in a hayloft out there, and we were going to sleep out there, but we had this roll of quarters, so we went down the road, and at a country store, and I don't remember what all we bought, but you know, cookies and things like that, you know, and that time we were gone for a couple of days, I think, and we got pretty tired and sick of it, you know, being out there by ourselves. So it was raining. It was pouring down rain, and we'd started walking back to school. It was probably about, you know, 7 or 8 miles, and we were walking along the highway, and it was raining, and a bus picked us up. But the bus driver stopped and picked us up, and it took us into town. It was a town called Hillsboro, and we went to the police station. We turned ourselves in, and we told them we'd run away from St. Mary's, and one of the officers, they took us back. So we got there back late at night, and again, Father Goodrich was there, and he didn't say anything. We just went up and went to bed, and again woke up in the morning, and it was almost like nothing had happened, and that's kind of the way it was. Yeah. I eat a lot of nuts. People snack on different things. I snack on nuts. I go to Fred Meyer and I buy some walnuts. I'll buy some Brazil nuts. I buy some almonds. I'll buy some peanuts, maybe 1 or 2 other kind of nuts, and I just mix them all together. And this is my snack. This was supposed to be a one of those frying pans you see on TV, where nothing sticks to it. You can cook eggs, it slides around. You know, if you cook an egg or whatever, you can stick in the oven, do whatever you want, and it doesn't stick. Well, don't believe it. I've had 3 of these, and they're all the same. After about a week or so, they start to stick. I don't know what I'm doing wrong, but I decided just to go back to using olive oil again. These are beans. I got 2 kinds of beans in there. Bush's vegetarian beans and black beans and corn. And the corn gives it a little bit of an extra flavor. And that's basically what I eat. You know, when I'm fixing dinner, I'll warm up beans, and along with meat or eggs, you know, and whatever else I eat. Once in a while I cook potatoes, once in a while I cook spaghetti and meatballs, but this is basically what I have. I don't know if I were to cook tonight. I have to go to Olympia probably around 6 o'clock, but so I'll have an early dinner. But I just cook some hamburger, some eggs. And so, what else now? There's a St. Mary's Academy out there that it used to be, I don't know what it is now, but it used to be an all-girls school, and it was down the road from, it was probably about a mile and a half down the road from St. Mary's Home for Boys. I went to St. Mary's with a guy named Ralph, or not Ralph, but Barry Gilbert, okay? And I don't even know if he's still alive. He was about a year or so older than me, but he had a sister that went to St. Mary's Academy down the road. Her name was Peggy. And when I was a kid, I went over to Barry's house a few times on the weekends when we went home, and Peggy was there, and we used to play Spin the Bottle. That's where you have some girls and boys in a room, and they spin the bottle, and whoever the bottle, whenever the bottle stops, whoever it's pointing to, you have to kiss them, or they have to kiss you. And it was just a game that kids play. Anyway, I played that game with Peggy. And then it was years later
when I was in my 20s. She and I were the same age, and we were born 12 days apart. I ran into Barry. He was in the Navy, and I ran into him one night. It was in a bar in Portland, and we talked about old times, and he invited me out to, he was staying with his mother at that time, and he invited me out to his mother's house. Well, it so happened that Peggy was there, and she had grown into quite a beautiful young woman, and she had an interesting story of her own to tell. She had married a doctor, a man from Iraq, and she was 18 and he was 35, and he married her and he took her to Iraq, and she had no idea what to expect. And apparently she was a blonde and she was quite beautiful. So she had to stay at home most of the time. She couldn't go outside the house on her own. She had to be accompanied by his mother or one of his relatives. And she had to wear a hood or a scarf and that kind of thing. And I remember her telling me once that one day she was over there 2 or 3 years, several years I guess, and she got so tired of it, she snuck out of the house on her own or went around the block and came back. But anyway, she got to where she couldn't, they had a couple of kids, and she got to where she couldn't take living like that anymore. And so they went to Europe, and while they were in Europe, they toured Europe for six years, or 6 months. And I guess they were followed everywhere by the Iraqi secret police, because they didn't want them. He was a doctor, he was a valuable person, and they didn't want him to escape from Iraq, to leave Iraq. But they had taken a bunch of jewelry with them, some gold and other kinds of jewelry, and they were able to sell it, and they got onto a plane. They were to escape the police, the secret police. They got onto a plane, they flew to America, and they sought asylum, or he sought asylum. I ran into her years later. They settled down in Salem. As he was a psychiatrist in the mental health institution down there, the state hospital. And anyway, when I ran into Barry, we went out to his mother's place. Peggy happened to be there. She was staying there for the weekend, and she and I, at that point, she was separating from her husband. I mean, they had grown apart. They hadn't separated, but there was a lot of talk about it because she was very dissatisfied with their marriage. So she and I started an affair, and it went on for a while, and I was living in Portland, and she was Salem, she lived in Salem, so I moved down to Salem to be close to her. But then the affair went kind of sour, so I was working in Salem, and that's where I met my wife. She was working nights at this cannery, and I was working in the cannery, and that's where I met her, and that's where we got married. We got married a short time, a couple of months after that, I guess. But looking back, I often thought that after my wife and I separated, I called Peggy. She and I talked on the phone, and I could have asked her I easily could have asked her, to see me, because by then she and her husband were almost separated. And I never did. It was one of those things I regret that I didn't ask to see her again, and we could have started a relationship again. Looking back, I wish I had. But anyway, that was the story of Peggy, and that's one of the things that happened to me when I was out at St. Mary's. Is I knew Barry as a friend, and then I met Peggy, and then when I grew up, I got older, into my 20s, Peggy and I got together, and it's a memorable experience.
Uh, so, Sister Christine, she was a nun at St. Mary's. She was part of the Franciscan order. And she had joined, she was originally from Olivia, Minnesota, which is central Minnesota. It's kind of a farming community. And I think she joined the nunnery right out of high school. And she was quite a pretty woman. And for some reason, I was like about 12 at the time, 11 or 12, and I suppose I just come into puberty. But she was probably in her late teens, maybe 20, maybe 21, 22. Well, no, she was older than that. I think she was about 10 years older than me. But for some reason, she became my favorite nun, and I became her favorite person out there. And it was almost, it was a love affair is what it was. But it was never, it never got beyond being platonic. But every time I saw her, she was out at the playground. She was what they call, what was it, provost, I'm not sure, I don't remember the exact word. But the nuns, there would always be a nun out on the playground to oversee things. And so whenever she was out there, I was always with her. And it was a genuine, she was older, I was younger, but it was, it was a real love affair. It just never really culminated in anything, sexual at that time. And this went on for about 2 years, and she played the organ, she played the piano, and whenever I would hear her up in the chapel was on the 3rd floor, whenever I would hear her up there, I would go up to the loft and sit there and listen to her. And I just liked being with her. It wasn't, it was sort of like young love. You're just with the person. You don't have to be doing anything. You're just with the person. And that's the way it was for about 2 years. And the funny thing was that everybody everybody at the school knew about it. The priest knew about it. The rest of the nuns knew about it. And nobody ever said much. Nobody ever said, reproached me or reproached her, as far as I know. And but it went on for quite a long time, for a couple of years, and then I graduated, and some years passed, and during those years that passed, I went out to St. Mary's a couple of times to visit, and I would always look her up, and we would talk, and anyway, one day I was out there, and there was another nun out there that from that period, and she told me, she said, well, Sister Christine has quit the nunnery, and she's living in California. And she gave me her address and her telephone number. So I called her up. I was living in Seattle at the time. And I called her up, and we talked. And I decided that I was going to go down to California and to be with her. And she was in San Jose at that time. So I had a little money, and I sold everything in Seattle. I went down, I took the train down to Seattle, and to San Jose, and she met me in San Jose. And we lived together I moved in with her, and we lived together for about 9 or 10 months. And just, it was man and wife. And it was, you would think that it would be sort of like the fulfillment of a dream, You go back to your old girlfriend, and you rekindle the relationship and that kind of thing. But I found that it wasn't quite the same thing. That sort of young love aspect of it wasn't really there. And it's almost because we had sex, you might say. And she was, the sex was never quite satisfying from my end. And there were some other things too. There were some personality things that had never been present in the relationship before. There it is. Well, anyway, so I would have been about, I think I would have been about 23 or 24 when I found out she was living in California. I went down to California. She was in San Jose there. And we lived together for about 10 months as man and wife, but it wasn't quite the same thing. It was just, I think, you know, I had just, when I left St. Mary's, of course, I went out and I had different experiences, and I experienced the world in a different way, and one thing or another, so you become a little more sophisticated about things, and you just develop different attitudes, you know, when you grow up a little, you know. And so it wasn't the same thing, and it took me about 10 months to figure it out, and besides which, I think she was kind of naive in a lot of ways. She had been a nun, and, you know, since high school. And when she lived in Olympia, I mean, it was probably a very small conservative community. She was a Catholic, and she just hadn't had many life experiences. And so I don't know. We found out. I think from my standpoint anyway, we were ill-matched, and we talked about marriage. In fact, we went so far as to get a marriage license. And, you know, in the end, when I thought about it, I thought I just couldn't imagine myself being married to her, you know. So I left. I went back to Seattle, and I talked to her on the phone a couple of times. I thought, well, you know, if nothing else, we could just maintain a friendship, you know, and keep in touch with each other, you know. And I talked to her on the phone a couple of times, but I never, after the second or third time, I never talked to her again. I haven't seen her. It's been years have gone by, and I've been curious about her, you know. I've gone online a couple of times with her name, see if, you know, if I could look her up, you know, but sometimes I think it's better just to, I guess the saying is to let old dogs lie or something. How do they put it? I'm not sure, but just to leave it be, you know. So anyway, yeah, that was one of the more memorable things that happened to me. And the other thing is, when I was out at St. Mary's, you know, when I was involved in this relationship with her, it was very special. It really gave me a kind of emotional outlet that I don't think I would have had otherwise. My dad was alive at that time, but he lived up in Seattle, and he worked construction. They traveled a lot, so I didn't see him that much. And the only person I saw really was my grandmother and my relatives who lived in there in Portland. And I had some memorable Christmases with them, and the Thanksgiving and that kind of thing, you know, big family type thing. But she almost made up for, she gave me that kind of close relationship that I think, you know, that a kid needs. And she might have been, in a sense, a big sister, a mother, and a lover of sorts, you know. So it was very special. And that time in my life, I probably needed something like that. Of course, then I didn't realize it, you know, and it's all looking back. But anyway, so that's, you know, so that was one of the memorable things of my life, you know. And she was quite a good person, you know. I often felt guilty because I know she wanted to get married. And I know she wanted the relationship meant the same thing to her that it had meant way back when I was out there, you know, when we were together at school. But as I say, I'd gone off into the world and seen some of it, and I'd been in the Army and one thing and another, and so it didn't mean the same thing to me. But it took me about 10 months or so to realize that. And I never told her that, you know, out of respect for her. But I just told her I didn't think it was going to work. So anyway, there you go. That's, yeah. So I don't know how much more time we've got here for anything. Okay. So my childhood wasn't I wouldn't call it idyllic, but it was filled with some adventures, and it was stable enough. And it wasn't until I got out of St. Mary's after I graduated there and went to live with my grandmother that things got kind of unstable. I became a little bit rebellious. I guess it was the away from the confines of the boarding school environment, and I think that I think once I got out of the environment, I sort of almost rebelled a little bit, got a little bit wild. Anyway, long story short, I went into the Army when I was 17, and I got out when I was 20. While I was in the Army, I was an infantry soldier, and I also had some extracurricular duties. I worked as a mail clerk. I was in Korea for 18 months, and while I was over there, I was a mail clerk, and we were up on the DMZ. And but I didn't particularly like the military, the regimentation. So when I got out of after 3 years, they wanted me to re-enlist, of course, but I didn't like the life that much. So anyway, I got out of the Army when I was 20 years old, and for the next few years, I worked at a variety of jobs, and then I met my wife, my ex-wife. And she was going to school in Monmouth, Oregon. It's now a teacher's college. Back then it was, I think it was just a liberal arts college. And she was going to school there. And I had, before that time, I'd gone to some night school at Portland State University. And so I had accumulated some credit hours. And I met my wife, and I was able to enroll in Monmouth College down there. And before I finished college, she and I had separated and divorced. Although I will say that one of the things that I was forever grateful to her for is that she didn't file for divorce until I was just about finished with school. So I was getting, she had 6 children, and so I was getting money from I went to school on the GI Bill. Back then I think I was getting $600 a month, which back then was decent money. And this was would have been in the early 70s. And plus I worked part-time, so I had a pretty easy time of it getting through school. I graduated in 1975. I had saved up quite a bit of money. I went to Europe for 6, 7 weeks, I forget exactly. Mainly because I met if it hadn't been for a young woman that I met when I was going to school. She was from Switzerland, and I guess I became enamored of her. And so she went back to Switzerland, and I saved up my money, and I went to Switzerland and to look her up, and things didn't quite work out. So anyway, I came back to, I came back and I landed on the East Coast. And my intention was to go back. I landed in New York, and I was in New York about 3 or 4 weeks. And I got into an altercation with a fellow. I was staying at the YMCA, and I got into an altercation with a fellow there. And he stabbed me in the face. And it kind of traumatized me. So I left New York and I went up to Portland, Maine. My intention was to save money and go back to Europe, and I was going to teach over there, maybe on a military base. So I went up to Portland, Maine. I was in New York about 3 or 4 weeks, and I got a job working there, but I forget exactly what it was doing. It was working on a company. It was a supervisor's job, and it was working in a company where they made pins, and I forget what they call it, but anyway, it was something along those lines. But then there was this thing that happened at the YMCA, and that kind of soured me on New York. So I went up to Portland, Maine, and I got a job up there working for a plumbing and heating company. And I was very lucky, because when I got to Portland, Maine, I didn't know anybody. I was absolutely new in town. And I got a room up there, and it was a fellow that, I forget exactly how we met. He was a cab driver, and maybe I took a cab ride or something. But anyway, he belonged to a local church, and he asked me if I would like to, come to a Sunday service. I'm not a church-going person. I was raised as a Catholic, but as soon as I got away from the boarding schools, the Catholic boarding schools, I guess I'd had so much religion tossed at me that I just rebelled against the whole thing. And I haven't really been religious since then. In fact, I've given it up altogether. But anyway, back in Portland, Maine, this fellow belonged to some church back there, and he said, well, would you like to come to Sunday Mass? Or not Sunday Mass, but Sunday service. And I thought, well, why not? I need to know somebody. I need to meet some people. So for the next few Sundays, I went over to, he would come over in his cab, and he'd pick me up, and he'd take me to, he and his wife they'd take me over to the church there. And the pastor thought he sort of thought that I was a fallen, what do they call that, a prodigal son or something like that, and that I was looking for redemption. That's how he saw me, which wasn't the case, but that's how he saw me. So he took a liking to me. He thought, I was a new member of the church and this sort of thing. It was a small membership too. So it was a case where they, I'm sure he welcomed anybody that came along. But anyway, on the basis of this, I was able to get a job after about a week or so by putting him down as a reference. And of course, if you put a pastor down as a reference, as a job application, it always looks good. So the fellow that hired me, he just assumed that, he assumed the best. and he hired me. So for the next 6 months, I worked there, and then I also got a job. I was saving money to go back to Europe, so I also got a job on a Friday and Saturday night working at Dunkin' Donuts. So I had a job during the week, and then on Friday and Saturday night, I worked at Dunkin' Donuts. Well, this went on for about 6 months, and I'd saved up quite a bit of money, a couple of $1,000s, and my goal was to work for a year and to save up about $4,000 or $5,000 and I go back to Europe when I was going to teach. Well, one Friday night, I guess it was, a Saturday night, things got pretty wild at Dunkin' Donuts. The bars would close down, okay, and then everybody would come into Dunkin' Donuts and buy coffee and one thing or another, and it was a pretty rowdy atmosphere, on a Friday night after that. And some fella had taken a dislike to me, and he came over the bar and he was going to beat me up. And I got into a fight with him and injured him. And it just so happened that he was a bodyguard for a pimp, and they put out the word that that he was gonna get even with me. So when I found that out, I quit the job. 2 days later, I left Portland, Maine. I never went back. I went down to New York. I was there a couple of days, and I decided I was going to go to Minneapolis. And I had heard that Minneapolis, if you went through their secondary education program there, you could teach anywhere in the country. It was because it was a respected program, and so you could go anywhere in the country, any state in the country, and teach. And I thought, well, I have a little money, I'll go there, get through the program, and then go back to Europe. That was the plan. And so I went to Minneapolis, and I wound up staying in Minneapolis for 10 years, and I never did go back to Europe. Anyway, after 10 years, I decided to go back to Portland, not Portland, Maine, but Portland, Oregon. That's where I'd gone to school originally. I went to Portland State University in Portland. That's where I graduated from. And that's where I was going on the GI Bill. And when I got back to Portland, I went to work in the mental health field. And I worked in that field for quite a long time. And I also had a job as an apartment house manager. It was more of a it was a combination rooming house and apartment house, and I had that job as a manager. So I had that job for about 5 years. So I did a lot of, that's when I started doing some writing in earnest. After about 10 years, I moved up to Tacoma. My stepmother was alive at that time, and she lived out on the peninsula. She and my dad had bought property out there back in the 50s when it was real cheap. I think they bought 3 acres for about $1,600, and she cleared it. Every day she'd work at it just a little at a time, a lot of blackberry bushes and that sort of thing, and she finally created quite a nice little piece of property. And then my dad, he would go to work, and she would, do this, go down to the area that needed to be cleared and work on it. And she created a lawn and everything. It was very nice. And it was sort of almost like a pioneer woman out there, and working out and clearing the blackberry bushes and one thing or another.
cutting down some shrubbery, some small trees and things. And I always had a lot of respect for her for doing that, for her ability to get out there and do it. Uh, anyway, my dad, I guess I should have mentioned, my dad died before I got out of the Army. So I didn't see her for quite a few years. When I was going to school, after I got out of the Army, I didn't bother to look her up. I guess I was in my late 30s when I came back from Minneapolis, maybe my early 40s. I reconnected with her, and things hadn't changed much. We never did really get along. We never did warm up to each other. But by that time, she was older, and when I moved up here to Tacoma, she became kind of dependent on me. I had a car, and I could do things for her, run errands for her, and that sort of thing, you know. And I would go out and cut the grass and one thing or another, you know, like that. So there was this kind of a relationship there. It got a little better than it had ever been, really. It never really got great, though. And there was just some bad memories, some bad blood between us, you know, that I never really, that made it difficult to form a good relationship with her. But anyway, she died about 10 years ago. And before she died, quite a few years before then, she had her daughter, Catherine, my half-sister, whom I hadn't seen for quite a few years either. Her daughter married a man who bought the property as a life estate, which meant that Dorothy, my stepmother, could live there the rest of her life. And then when she died, the property would revert to the man who bought it, Catherine's husband. And all she had to do was maintain it. She didn't have to pay the taxes or anything, but she could live there the rest of her life. Well, that's what happened. She died and the property reverted to him. And I have to say that there was a point, there was a time when I thought, well, if he dies first and she lives, then she would have to, and then Catherine died too. Catherine, her sister, or not her sister, but her daughter, my half-sister, stepsister died of lung cancer. And so I thought, well, you know, that maybe she would, if she died, or if the other fellow died, and if she died, then maybe the property would come to me. But it didn't work out that way. And that was kind of a cynical view of it all. I appreciate that. But anyway, I can't say that I hated my mother, hated her. I never did. I can't even say that I disliked her. I just never felt much for her at all. But she was my last connection to that part of my life, to my dad, my stepsister, and my grandmother, and some few other family members. You know, she was my last connection to that. And when she passed away, all those connections were gone. And so since then, I do have a half brother, but I've only seen him about 2 or 3 times in my life. My dad, he was quite an interesting character. I believe when this was during the Prohibition, he came out here to the West Coast, and he took up with some people out on Key Peninsula. And this was before the bridge was built. So the only way over there was a ferry or boats. And during Prohibition, he bought a cabin cruiser for himself. And he would go up to Vancouver or to Victoria, and he would buy
cases of whiskey and scotch and that sort of thing. And then he'd bring it back down here and sell it out to his friends and people out here on the peninsula, on the Key Peninsula. So he did that for a while, but he did get caught, and eventually he got caught. And he had to spend a year in McNeil Island. And he was a little ashamed of that, but looking back, I mean, I think to myself, well, it's kind of like getting caught for selling marijuana. It's no big deal. But anyway, when he came out of there, he apparently, when he was there, he learned to be an electrician. So when he got out of there, he became an electrician, and then later in life, he became a supervisor. So he had some quite good jobs. He became a general supervisor for the construction of some power lines up around Mount Baker, and then there's the couple of things out on the Olympic Peninsula, and then he worked down in Mexico and Alaska. So he did pretty well for himself, considering that he left home at 13 and he didn't finish school, So anyway, while he lived out on the peninsula, while he was during Prohibition, he married a woman out there, and they had a child. That would have been my half brother. I know where he lives. He lives over over near Spokane, up in Chewelah. It's up in the mountains above Spokane there, and he and his wife live over there. And I think he's in his 80s, well into his 80s. And I've known that for some time, and I just don't. I'm kind of torn. I don't know. I haven't seen him for so long. I haven't seen him for probably 35 or 40 years. So I'm kind of torn. I just don't know whether to look him up or not. Sometimes it's better just to leave, just to stay away from it. So anyway, that's, he was my half brother, and as I say, he was a nice fella. He was in the Navy, but I only met him 2 or 3 times, so I don't really know that much about him. Anyway, let's see. I met Linda Thomas when I worked in the mental health field. We both worked at a group home. This was in outside of Beaverton in a little town called Aloha, Oregon. And she was quite a nice person, a very lovely person, a very caring kind of person. And you could tell this through the people that she worked with. We worked with mentally ill people, and they can sometimes be difficult, and it requires a lot of patience and a lot of understanding. And she just seemed to have this. It just kind of came from part of who she was. So she was very good at the job. But I was also very attracted to her, and she was attracted to me. And nothing ever happened on the job. But I asked her one time if we could get together and have coffee. So the first time we got together, it was actually in Portland. We met at a restaurant in Portland, and we had lunch, and we sat and talked for 3 hours. And it was the lunch hour, and by the time we were finished, the restaurant was empty. Everybody had come and eaten their lunch, and we were the last ones there. So anyway, the second time we went out and had lunch, she told me, she said, I've got an appointment I have to go to. So I took that to mean that she didn't want to spend so much time
sitting in a restaurant talking, which was okay. I wasn't offended, of course, but anyway, shortly after that, she was accepted by the University of Montana in Missoula for a doctorate program in, I think it was psychology, or one of those fields, behavioral fields, I think, behavioral psychology, I guess it was. So she was accepted in this program over in Missoula. So we never really had a chance to get this relationship going. And I often regret that because I liked her very much, and it was very easy for me to talk to her, and I was very comfortable with her at that time. I had an apartment in Portland, and at one point I considered moving over to Missoula to be with her, and I remember I wrote her a letter, a very nice letter, and she answered my letter, and it was, nowadays it's all done in tweets or, texting and this kind of thing. This was an actual letter. And I asked her, I said, well, how long does it take to drive over there? I thought, well, I'll go over on a weekend maybe and visit her and see what, see if we could, if we would want to get together. So she told me it takes 11 hours to get there, to drive over there. And so she told me it takes 11 hours to make the drive over there, and I never did. I never made the drive. And now, looking back after all these years, this was like 25, I don't know, it was back in 87, 88 maybe. So this was quite a few years ago. But I still think about her occasionally. I kept the letter that she wrote to me, and I often think it might have been a smart move for me because I really liked the woman and we liked each other. That was very important. And so I often think maybe it's something I should have done, but I never did it. And of course, since then I've lost track of her. I don't know whether she ever completed the doctoral program over there or not. She was a very capable, a smart woman, so I'm sure she got through it. But you know how it is, people move on to other things in their lives. And so anyway, that's the end of it. We never saw each other again. I never heard from her again. But it's something I think about, It's one of those things you reflect on once in a while. She moved on to other things, and I moved on to other things. So I was writing at the time. I worked a 4-day week, 10 hours a day, so I had 3 days a week off. And back in those, yeah. This freight train coming now is going to make a lot of noise. Yeah, even after the horns have been blowing. Yeah. So anyway, as I say, at the time, I lived in Portland. I worked a 40-hour week, but 10 hours a day, so I had 3 days a week off. And I didn't go to work until 1 o'clock. I didn't have to be to work till 1 o'clock, so I would get up in the mornings and write. And I did that for the longest time. And I was working on a novel that based on something that happened to me in Minneapolis when I was living in Minneapolis. And I don't know how many, I must have spent several years on that novel. And I'd never written a novel before, so it was my first real attempt at writing fiction. But anyway, long story short, I eventually finished the novel, but when I finished it, I was very unhappy with it. And so I never tried to get it published. But, so I put it aside. I still have it. I think that maybe one of these days I might sit down and try to rewrite it. But in the meantime, I've moved on. I've tried to do other things. Writing has played a big part of my life. It has consumed a lot of hours, a lot of time. And not everybody who writes makes it. I can't say that I haven't made it, but there's always that possibility. So that's what I'm hoping for.